So really, seriously, thanks so much for joining me today in Silicon Heartland Sessions. Today we've got Rehgan Bleile, who is the co-founder and CEO of AlignAI. AlignAI is a company that helps enterprises manage their AI initiatives in one place. So thanks for joining me today, Rehgan.
Thanks so much for having me on. I'm excited. This podcast seems so awesome. So thanks for inviting me as a guest.
Well, thank you. Thanks for being here. We've got a great community here in Columbus. We're very, very lucky. And what makes up a great community? Well, it's great people like you, great leaders like you. So thanks for coming and sharing your wisdom. So we're going to talk a bit about professional and personal development, talk a little bit about leadership, and we'll talk a bit about tech. So let's start with some personal and professional development, and maybe get to know you a little bit, relative to your career. So maybe we could just start with maybe walking us through some of the key milestones in your journey as co-founder and CEO at AlignAI, and what would you consider your top career accomplishments that have defined your journey?
Yeah, I mean, usually I tell people now, this is more common than it used to be, that I've been in the AI space for almost a decade. And I say that now because I kind of have to, because I think it's important. But also, it's true. I got insanely fascinated by this space 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago. And I started as an industrial systems engineer as a student at Ohio State, and I specialized in computer science, and I stumbled across machine learning, and I thought, oh my God, you can build a crystal ball that will predict the future. How cool. And that's what got me quite fascinated with the space. And then, I've got a technical brain, so I went deep into how does this work? What tools are out there? What can I learn? And I went down these crazy YouTube rabbit holes for years. And at the time, it was kind of the big data boom, and first hype cycle of data science, and that was just really fun for me. And I consider that like the fun exploratory stage of my career. And I got into actually teaching data science courses. So I would travel all around the US to different colleges and teach introduction to data science courses in Python. And that was a lot of fun for me. I always say, if you teach something, you got to know it at a level 10, because you have to be able to explain it at a level 1. And I loved that phase of my career. It was really, really fun and really open-ended, and not really like hyper-focused on something, right? It was just, what can I do? What's fun? What's out there? What can I try? And got, landed a job at an MLOps company out of Chicago and headed to New York a ton, worked out of New York for a number of years. Most of our customers were out there, and man, that was the first time I got to see the level of complexity at the large enterprise, especially around a topic like machine learning. Mm-hmm. So super incredible milestone for me, just being able to observe a lot of that and being around the people that I was around at the time. And, actually going out and starting my own company was obviously one of the biggest milestones of my career.
No doubt.
And that story is just wild because I put my 2 weeks in on February 28th of 2020, and my last day of work was Friday the 13th in March.
Oh my gosh. 2020. Talk about an ominous.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
I was leaving the company for good, and everybody at the company was leaving the office for a pandemic. And it was the craziest day ever. I remember every minute of that day.
And were you still in New York at the time?
No, I was actually here in Columbus. I did a very short stint at a startup here after that other job that I was at, and then really wanted to get back to my core, wanted to get back to what I loved. And so decided, okay, what better way to do that than start my own thing?
That is quite the out of the box thinking. There are not a lot of people in the world that would take that kind of a direction in their career, especially considering, your start at OSU, and, taking that leap from, you can speak to this if you'd like to, but taking that leap from industrial engineering to data science and doing programming and then artificial intelligence. I have to imagine that a lot of what motivates you is your passion for new and emerging technologies. Is that accurate?
For sure. I think for me, the systems engineering degree is actually so underrated. And it's so wild because if you look at the curriculum for it, you get things like, Lean Six Sigma, right? Where we're trying to optimize systems. You get things like operations research, or linear and nonlinear programming. You get change management courses. And you can even get into like manufacturing ergonomics, that kind of side of it too. But there's a really heavy emphasis on how do you create change? How do you optimize a system? And really that's what machine learning is. It's an objective function that you're optimizing towards. And when you think of things holistically, it's not too far of a leap. And now the computer science specialization definitely helped because data science at least was and mostly still is pretty CS heavy. But yeah, I think it was mainly the fascination of how does this work? This is very complicated. How does this work? And just wanting to pursue that endlessly.
Yeah, no kidding. And the field of AI and machine learning is so fast moving. Is that also a part of the appeal to you?
Yes, it is. I mean, it has been in the last 2 years, that's for sure. If you look at the last 60 years, that can seem kind of like it's not super fast moving, right? We go from the very first language model that was developed about 60 years ago, ELIZA, and then we head to where we're at today. That doesn't feel like fast, but when you look at the last 2 years, it feels like warp speed. I think for me, it wasn't moving super fast in the beginning. And so I could take my time kind of learning a lot of the intricacies of the system. It was the complexity that was fascinating to me. And now it's moving very fast. And I honestly feel like if I didn't have that level of foundation on the complexity, I would not be able to really keep up to where things are at today. So yeah, I mean, I do enjoy the speed. I do have a little bit of an adrenaline addiction.
Excellent.
But I think the foundation and complexity was what was most appealing originally.
Right. But I think the thing that, just really sort of inspires me is the fact that, you're not just in a field that is fast moving, you're a leader in the field, right? I mean, there's not a lot of people that make the decision to change, to chart their career course into a field as fast moving as AI, and then decide, hey, you know what, I'm going to go start a company. As you think about your role as a leader in this, fast evolving field, how do you navigate the challenges that come with being a leader in such a fast-moving field like artificial intelligence?
I do think there's extra pressure to stay current, right? So I spend a lot of my time going from strategic thinking to detailed technical conversations.
I believe it.
And it might just be a derivative of the phase we're in as a company, but I am very, very much in the weeds. And I'm in the weeds in all of our customer accounts. I'm in the weeds of our product. I'm in the weeds of everything. I want to know exactly technically how stuff works. And, there are different philosophies, I think, about leadership. But I'd say this space is pretty unique in the sense that the devil's in the details and the nuance is what matters. And I think as a leader, it's important to respect that. And so for me, I spend a lot of time trying to balance, one, what does it mean to be a leader in general, regardless of the technology? And two, what does it mean to be a leader in such a technical space?
So I think the thing that fascinates me is, when it comes to your experience as a leader in artificial intelligence with these very nascent kind of skills and the technology and so forth. I'm curious, how much do you, because obviously being very knowledgeable about the technology is very important to you. It's very important to, the way in which you run your business. And I assume the way in which you, the confidence you can draw from that as a leader. And I wonder, as I've, progressed in my career, obviously I've taken a different course. I found myself in situations where, we're talking technology that I'm not familiar with. And I often have to sort of refer back to and think about the first principles that I learned when I was, growing, because I came up in app dev, and I've gotten a lot of traction out of being able to do that and relying on the concepts and so forth. Because at the end of the day, this is just technology, right? Technology evolves, and those concepts that you learned way at the beginning are still relevant. Do you find that in artificial intelligence, and given your experience as in like systems engineering, do those first concepts still resonate? And can you see that sort of trajectory there? And do you still use those skills that you learned back when you were teaching?
Yeah, it's changed a lot in the sense that, the layers of abstraction change over time, right? So I think that's the hard part, because when you're developing, machine learning systems in 2016 versus when you're developing, generative AI systems today, are the core principles still the same? Yeah, we're using data and math and stats, and we're running it on compute. So, yeah, that's still true. It's just the techniques are different. The layers of abstraction to interface with different things is different. And that's what changes. And, sometimes the levels of complexity and the levels of, the techniques you need, for example, evaluating a model is much different today than it was 8 years ago. Right. There's still some core principles that exist, but these generative models need different types of evaluation techniques. And so you got to learn them. We didn't have things like benchmarks for a long time. That kind of developed out of research that has happened over the last, 5-6 years. So I think that part's hard because it's learning something new. But again, the foundation's already there. So as long as you're kind of drawing it back to the foundation, there's maybe some new concepts you need to know, but I'm not alone in this. Everyone is going through this learning curve as well.
Well said. Yeah. Yeah, no kidding. And, earlier we were talking about some of the resources that you use on podcasts you listen to and so forth. I imagine that listening to podcasts and reading and so forth online are an important part of staying up to date in terms of the progression and the evolution of these technologies. I'm just curious, you'd mentioned podcasts like Lex Friedman's podcast, Super Data Science podcast, and Qualified Sales Leader. Just, for our listeners, not everybody's going to be familiar with these podcasts, but I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on these podcasts? How do you integrate the insights that you get from the podcast into your daily life? And how do you find the time to listen to them?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people forget that Lex Friedman came from the AI space, right? He's been in AI for a long time, and then he became a pretty popular podcaster. And so he has tons of different types of guests on his podcast now, which is actually super great and fascinating. But for a long time, he had a lot of AI researchers on his podcast. That's how I found him. So some of my favorite people in the AI space over the last 6 years have been on his podcast. So that's how I originally discovered him. But now he obviously has a lot more diversity in the types of topics that he covers, which I actually also quite enjoy. I think you don't want to sit in an echo chamber. I actually think quite a bit about, he did a recent episode in the Amazon jungle, talking about the different types of animals. And so I like to listen to those types of things too, because you don't want to you can get inspired by things that are not directly associated with what you are working on. And so I
Very
do try to
true.
keep some variety in there. But of course, you got to consume a lot of information. In fact, I often have this thought, we train these generative models on all sorts of different types of sources. And that's literally what we're doing to ourselves when we listen to podcasts. We're just like training our brain on new information.
Right.
And so the more I can highly curate what that content is, the better I become. And same thing for when you're training a model. So I do spend a lot of time curating the information that I consume. And I like podcasts because you can, get in the car and listen to it, or I travel a lot for my job. And so when I'm on an airplane, I'll download it and listen to it and, answer emails on a plane, or if I'm sitting in an airport, or if I'm sitting in traffic in New York for an hour to get to the city, there's plenty of times where I can be listening to something, or if I'm painting my kitchen like I was last night, I can throw on an episode. But I do listen to a lot of kind of deep technical topics as well. The Super Data Science podcast you mentioned, John Crone, good friend. He is awesome and his podcast is amazing. And, I just listened to a phenomenal episode on agentic workflows yesterday and shared it with my team and was like, you have to listen to this. There's a lot of great content in there that if you find good sources, they do the curation part for you.
Yeah, no kidding. That's a great way of putting it. Pulling that thread on kind of the diversity of thought. I know that you're very, technically oriented and probably spend a heck of a lot of your time listening to the technology podcasts and so forth and all those kinds of details. But I know you're very involved with social issues as well. Are there specific issues that you're particularly passionate about and actively involved in? And I'm just curious, these social causes, how do these social causes intersect with your work?
Yeah, I think for me, I've always been very passionate about this idea of responsible AI. And I know that's very overlapped with what I do for my work, but I do think it has a major societal impact. It is something that I have been focused on for the last 6 years. In fact, I found a panel discussion I did at the Women in Analytics conference 5 years ago with Kathy O'Neill, who wrote the book Weapons of Math Destruction. And, it's an entire book about ethics and AI and the intersection of that. And how organizations are leveraging the technology and whether they're doing that for good or not, and what are the outcomes that result in some of these systems. And so, that it's been a topic I've very much cared about for a long time. And when I first got into the space, I quickly realized that there was a huge lack of diversity in the space. And for me, not only was that
I agree.
kind of annoying, but I was also kind of used to it because, I was an engineer. So kind of comes with the territory. But it also has major ripple effects in the space as well. So you don't design holistic systems if you don't have people who understand the nuances of those systems. And that is very true for AI. We are still, as people, building these systems and designing these systems, making conscious decisions on what to include and what not to include. And this is something I harp on a lot. It's the ultimate question of what is good and what is bad. And with AI, you have to determine what is good and what is bad. Is this good data or bad data? Is this a good outcome or a bad outcome? Or is this a good output or a bad output? And it is in almost the eyes of the beholder, like the person who is interacting with that system or designing it. You represent those users. And so this is the first time that we are active participants. We, as a larger collective in society, we are active participants in AI. You get to go to ChatGPT and you get to actively interact and engage with it. Whereas before we were more passive participants. It recommends a movie to you on Netflix and you click it or you don't. And so I think that is a great movement because we're actually driving more towards understanding and a little bit of transparency, in the sense that you can understand as a user whether or not these outputs are good or bad from the system. And
Right.
so for me, I have always been a big advocate for getting more diverse voices in this space, mainly to ensure that we're thinking about these problems holistically. And I'm really, really happy to see that that has gotten more attention over the years.
Agree. So for the listeners who may not be familiar with the concept of ethical AI, how do you think about AI, and why is AI so uniquely built to require us to think about things like ethical usage and things like that?
Yeah, I think if you look at kind of the history of technology, ethical use has always been a problem. And it's not just on the AI side. You know, even as an engineer, you take an ethics class, and part of that ethics class is if you build a bridge and the bridge collapses and kills people, who's responsible for that? You know, that is a thing
Yeah.
that you must think through as an engineer, as a builder, and what's considered negligence and what's not. You know, so I think this has always been a problem with technology. The the thing that makes AI maybe a little unique in this problem space is the level of complexity that exists with it and the scale at which it can impact several people, millions of people
Right.
potentially, right? So that's why Kathy called her book Weapons of Math Destruction. She talks
Right.
about there being a small scale impact, but because these things can scale very quickly, aka look at what happened with ChatGPT. I mean, it's not saying that that was a bad thing, but like how many users people brag about how many users were acquired by that one tool in a short period of
Hmm.
time.
Right.
That is called scale. And so if there was something pretty destructive about that, that could have been a huge problem. And there are huge problems that have happened, like we're seeing with
Hmm.
the deep fake issues with AI as well.
Very
And so
true.
I think the scale is one, and the level of complexity and ambiguity is the other. You know, we
Right.
still don't really understand why the models are doing what they're doing, these
Right.
transformer models.
Right.
And we know how they work, but we don't understand why sometimes it's giving particular outputs.
Right.
And that is problematic. It is a really big area of research and study, and the why matters, actually, and that is something that we need to be focused on holistically.
Right. That's very, very well said. I would say, one of the things that I've talked about as well, relative to the ethical use of these AI models, is sort of the lack of transparency into the data that actually is used to train these models. And I wonder, I guess we're all sort of waiting with bated breath in terms of how the regulatory landscape is going to evolve to catch up to kind of where we're at from a tech perspective. But I wonder if transparency is one of the mechanisms by which we can start to to ameliorate some of these ethics considerations and so forth.
Yeah, I think so. This has always been a requirement, and especially in industries like financial services. If you're denied a loan, you have the legal right to know why you've been denied
Right.
that loan. And you can't use a model that doesn't tell you why it came to a certain conclusion. So, in the financial services space, they do not use generative models for things like that. They
Mm-hmm.
can't because they cannot explain why that person was denied. Now, there's other techniques you can use in machine learning that can give you um, information as to why it's coming up with that conclusion, less complex
Right.
models, for example. But yeah, I mean, it's very important. I mean, these things have impact. And so when you think about, human rights around all of this activity, the first is, are we using this in the right way? So if I have a model that predicts whether or not you're likely to go back to jail and it's accurate, what do we do with that? Societally, like, do we give them proactive programs that will prevent them from doing that? Or do we monitor them more closely and wait for that person to mess up and then take them to jail? So the model didn't change, the system didn't change. It's what we did with it. And I think the use side is what's being heavily regulated right now.
Right.
What are we doing with that information? What are we allowed to do? What are we not allowed to do? The second is what you brought up as well, which is the data privacy side
Right.
and the acceptable use around data and how that's being leveraged.
Right. So when you think about, building these kinds of systems, kind of going back to your comment earlier about, hey, AI is really an evolution of things that we've been doing for decades. You have to have compute, you got to have data, you got to have an application that does stuff with that data and so forth. And building these systems is a very complex endeavor. And then when you weave in the fact that we need to be thinking through how these systems are built to ensure that they're being used ethically and responsibly. I'm just curious, from a leadership perspective, how do you make sure, or what strategies do you use to inspire and align your team along towards like a common vision to make sure that at the end of the day, what's getting delivered is in alignment with your values and your requirements, et cetera?
Yeah, this is really big for me. I mean, we're still quite a nimble, small team,
Yeah.
intentionally so. And I think what's good about that is alignment is much easier, right? And it's in our name, Align AI, right? So we should be good at alignment. I think the tactics that I've found to be pretty successful is being very intentional about what our values are. What are our values as a company? And we have three very distinct values that have never deviated from the first day that we created them. And we demonstrate what that looks like to have those values. So that's on the value side, to make sure everybody's aligned on that perspective. Is, I mean, every quarter we bring them back up, we talk about them. One thing we used to do was every week, discuss somebody or call out somebody who had demonstrated that value
Hmm.
in a positive way. And I think values can be really squishy and really abstract and really, high level. But
Mm-hmm.
one of the values we have is seek to understand before being understood. And so
Okay.
that is a very core principle for us. We try really hard to listen and not have a rebuttal right away on something, but really try to
Right.
understand exactly where that person is coming from.
I
And
like
that
that.
makes us a lot more effective and efficient as an organization. That's pretty easy to do. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you just need to, stop talking and listen and ask more questions.
Listen.
So
Mm-hmm.
that's an example of that. Another area of alignment for us is we kind of reiterate what our mission and vision is as a company. And if we're not doing activities that fall into that bucket, we shouldn't be doing them.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Here's our mission as a company. Here's where we want to go. Does this fall in line with our mission? Yes, great. Let's pursue it. We are pretty ruthless in terms of prioritization. Technique my co-founder and I use is called our company priorities document. We have every function of our entire company listed out. We revise it every quarter, and we go through it every morning. So we look at everything, like on the legal side, on the finance side. Is there anything that we need that needs our immediate attention today?
Mm-hmm.
Where did we
Mm-hmm.
leave off on that? And how do we stack rank them in terms of what's most important right now? And so we kind of recreate that holistic list every quarter. And every morning we look at it and we talk about it. Where are we at with this? What do we need to do today for this? Nothing gets dropped. And if something gets dropped, it's because it's intentional and it's not a
Right.
priority.
Yeah, I love that. This whole idea of being intentional about your values, over, communicating about it continually, and sort of making a part of your daily, for lack of a better word, like your daily ritual. This is like a part of the thing that we do every day to, not only make sure that we're focused on the right things, but we're all aligned, not only with what we're trying to do, but we're aligned, from an ethics perspective and from a values perspective and so forth. I imagine that there are times when you're faced with, having to make decisions under pressure, or maybe there are times when you're faced with decisions where values could be in conflict. I'm just curious, with your team, how do you approach making difficult decisions, especially when you're under pressure?
Yeah, it's a really hard thing to do. I mean, if it were easy, everyone would do it. I think I think the best thing is really breaking down exactly what is being challenged. So what is making this decision hard? Why are we under pressure? And trying to be as preventative as possible. So for us, I believe in extreme transparency. So if we are trending down on something, I
Mm-hmm.
will let people know months ahead of time. We are
Right.
trending down. We should never be caught by surprise that we are in a, hard situation. And I think that's important because that's where you end up making irrational decisions because
Mm-hmm.
you're not prepared to handle that. Um, we try our best to ease into the hard situations whenever we can, right? As
Mm-hmm.
much as we can. And there's things you're going to miss. Like you're of course not going to catch everything and be able to prevent everything.
Right.
But being proactive is much better than being reactive in those situations. And I'd say in the
Yeah.
cases where we've had to be reactive, putting it into some context, I think is important.
Right.
I read all of these posts about people who are second, third time founders, and I think there's something to be said about what you panic over as a first time founder versus what you panic over as a second and third time founder.
Right. I bet.
Because yeah, you think everything is the big deal, and the reality is that it's not. It's recoverable. It's not the end of the world. And sometimes you just need somebody to help you put that into perspective. So someone who has dealt with that before, and can we create a game plan and just staying calm,
Right.
in those scenarios. And I can tell you there's been plenty of oh my God scenarios.
I believe it.
But those are the things that have helped me.
So when you do have those oh my god experiences, what techniques do you use to personally stay motivated? Obviously, there's a lot to be said, as you were saying. There's a lot to be said for experience and so forth. First time founders, third time founders, folks who are in the enterprise and have maybe gone from one job to another and kind of progressed in their career. I think you sort of learn over time, what are the things that I should be worried about versus what are the things that let it roll off. But I'm just curious, we're all faced with, with challenges. And how do you personally stay motivated and keep your team motivated, especially when those challenges seem insurmountable?
I always think of a quote that my dad gave me early on in my career. So my dad's former Navy SEAL. So motivation for him is like incredible, right?
Right, right, right.
Everything he does is he's motivated and disciplined, and I've been
Yeah,
very fortunate to have his guidance in some of that. And one thing he said to me early on is motivation is fleeting, never rely on it.
I love it. This
So
sounds like it's a David Goggins quote. Have you ever read
it's got
anything
to
by
be
David Goggins? Yeah,
right.
yeah,
And we
he's
bred
just,
from the same mentality.
the only difference is that David Goggins probably threw in a couple F words in the middle of it. But
Sure,
yeah,
sure, 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 for
yeah,
sure.
yeah.
Yeah.
I love that
Um,
quote. Yeah, heck yeah.
it's true though. It's fleeting, and you never rely on motivation. What you rely on is discipline.
Exactly.
And so for me, discipline is everything. That's why we
Hmm.
go through that document every morning. That's why we have, rituals that make sense for us to continue to do on a regular basis. Because I can tell you there are many, many, many days where I do not feel motivated.
Yeah.
And you got to get up and do it anyway. So the only thing I can lean back on is discipline. The motivation is important in cases like we got to get motivated in some ways. You can't just not be motivated the whole time. You will burn out. So I'd say like wins are very motivating. Like when we land a really big customer, like very exciting, very motivating. We feel like we're
Heck
on the right
yeah.
track,
Heck yeah.
that helps. So getting to those wins helps. Being passionate about what you're doing. Obviously, I have a lot of passion about the field I'm in. I care about it very deeply. That helps because I feel like I have a North Star that's meaningful. And honestly, the people I work with are so much fun to work with. Like we have and fun in the way that like when you're performing really well with a team, it's fun. It's not
Heck
fun
yeah.
like we're having pizza parties and,
Yeah.
going to happy hours every day. It's
Mm-hmm.
fun because we're performing really well. And
Right.
that is very motivating because then you're kind of doing it as a collective and as a group, and it's not just for you. It's kind of for the holistic team. And so those
Yeah.
things are what keeps me going.
I love it. I love it. I love your quote. I didn't know that your father served in the Navy. I served in the Navy myself. I wasn't a SEAL or anything like
I
that,
know.
but that is really awesome. Have you heard? Do you know Jocko
Yeah.
Willink? Have you ever read his book Extreme
Yeah.
Ownership? Or
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
yeah, yeah. Have you ever seen his video Good?
I don't know if I
When
have
Yeah,
actually.
when it's a short video, it's so good though, and it's all about how. So his answer when things go bad, and things are just flying off the rails or whatever, the word he uses is good. That's
Oh, wow.
yeah, life is full of obstacles, and
Yeah.
any obstacle can be turned into an opportunity. So when things go bad, there's only one word: good.
That's great. I love that. I think, it's what keeps you sharp. I mean, it is. It's the thing that's thrown at you when you're training. You
Yeah,
you go through pain when you're training.
heck
It's
yeah,
because it keeps you sharp.
yeah,
So I agree. I agree to an
yeah,
extent.
yeah. So, obviously relationships are very important to you. Team dynamics are very, very important to you. I would imagine, culture is very, very important to you. And, can't do you can't, in my mind, can't, deliver in accordance with your values if you don't have the right culture and you don't have the right connectivity with your team. So, when you think about like going back to what you were saying earlier about the pandemic and so forth and how the workforce is changing, like the workplace itself is evolving. We're a much more, virtual kind of a community now, it feels like. And lots of companies are still fully remote. Some are in most, I would say, are probably in sort of this hybrid kind of a mix. But as you think about the virtual world and in particular artificial intelligence, how do you envision technology shaping the future of work and the workplace? And like what role do you see AI playing in the evolution of work environments?
Culture is something I think very, very deeply about. Not only how to establish good culture at our company to make sure that we're sustainable because that is set very early on in a company, but we work with really large enterprises. I mean,
Mhm.
tens of thousands of people, sometimes globally, sometimes speaking several different languages,
Right.
all with their own kind of subcultures. And when you think about change, which is exactly what's happening, is an insurmountable amount of change. You have to think about how that shifts and shakes culture. And the reason culture is so important is because it's directly associated with productivity.
Mm.
Good cultures drive productivity.
Interesting.
And of course, we all want good culture for many reasons. Mental health is very important. I don't want to underplay that at all. But
Hmm.
at the end of the day, companies should be very motivated, if not for the productivity. And so when I think
Right.
about AI, that's where we're headed, right? The whole drive around this is to automate intelligence. I mean, that's exactly where people are going. And I know most people will say, okay, human in the loop, augmented decisions, augmented
Hmm.
intelligence. I agree. I totally agree. But there's a sense of there's a piece of automation that's happening, even if it's human in the loop, even if it's augmented.
Hmm.
There's still, or else we wouldn't be doing it, right? Like there's got to be some level of efficiency and productivity gain, and that scares a lot of people.
Can you maybe just give a definition for what you mean by augmented for those that aren't familiar with that concept?
Sure. Yeah, so an augmented kind of workflow, right, would be if I'm leveraging an AI system and it doesn't automatically, you know, cook my meal and serve it on the dinner table, right? It augments my decision making on what sort of meal I'm going to cook. So it
Right.
didn't automate me out of the process of coming up with a recipe and cooking my meal. It just
Gotcha.
augmented that process for me in
Right.
making that decision. And that is mostly what's happening today with AI, right? It's augmenting that decision making process with more information,
Right. Right.
or differently structured information.
Right.
Um, so yeah, I think that's the piece, right? We're sick of doing tedious exercises. Who loves searching around a SharePoint site to try to find the information you're looking for? No one. And so when we
Right.
think about those types of tasks, it's pretty obvious for people like, yeah, I'd rather not do that type of work anymore. But the
Right.
hard part is we're starting to bleed into the domain expertise side, which is not just automating the tedious, I don't want to do it anymore tasks. It's automating the thought provoking piece of our jobs, which is actually the most fulfilling piece. So there's a lot of controversy about what that means and how companies do that. And I'd say people were kind of scared at first of like, quote, getting automated out of a job. But the way to think about it is getting, tasks within your job
Mm-hmm.
being supported by AI and not the job holistically.
Right.
So
What do you say to, engineers, software engineers that are worried about artificial intelligence automating them out of a job?
yeah, it's funny because I actually use the software engineering one as my example often,
Heck yeah.
because it can be quite good. Actually, I'm not sure if you've messed around with any of the kind of Copilot coding
Yeah, absolutely.
tools,
Mm-hmm.
but they're pretty good. I mean, my dev team uses them. I encourage
Right.
them to use those tools, right?
Heck yeah.
So I think the thing I would say, and maybe this is a little bit of a controversial statement, but I'll say it anyway. I'm quite worried about entry level positions in
Mm-hmm.
this entire phase, right? Because if you think about it, these systems are not perfect, right? They're statistical based. So that means that they're wrong. So I always say not if they're wrong, when they're wrong, right?
Well said.
And the people who know it deeply and are deeply aware of what is good and bad. So what's good code, what's bad code,
Yeah.
they can use these tools more efficiently and more productively, right? Because they can look at a code block and they can be like, that's not right. Here's why. And they can do that really quickly. Whereas your entry level, they don't know. They don't know the difference between good code and bad code. They don't have that level of expertise to be able to spot that. And so when they're using the tool, they may use it inappropriately or they may use bad code and their work products will be worse and they'll learn bad patterns and they also struggle a lot to determine if it's good or bad. So it takes actually more time for them.
Right.
So I am concerned about where we go with the entry level positions at companies, and I think that conversation should be had.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it. I think that I wonder, I guess, when I sort of wind the clock forward, I wonder if the actual building blocks, the tools that we use, the very tools that we use to to create systems. And obviously, when it comes to, what you're talking about in terms of automating jobs and so forth, there's in my mind, there's two sides to it. There's the building of it, but then there's the design of it. And there is in my opinion, these are very human endeavors because they all go back to your point earlier about building systems that meet the needs of the people that will be using them and making sure that those systems are designed and built in alignment with not only those requirements but also the values that you mentioned before that that we all align to, at the companies that we work at. I don't see how those human endeavors could be automated, or if we would ever want to automate those parts of, the this endeavor for building systems and new technologies and innovating and so forth, you know?
I agree. I think there are a lot of people who are claiming that these systems are good at that. I've personally not seen them be very good
Yeah.
at that. Right? Because we still have to direct and guide them for the most part. Now we're going
Yeah.
into these like kind of agentic type of workflows where we can start to break apart the different tasks and they can influence each other based on what's good. But at the end of the day, these things have an objective function they're optimizing to. And who sets that objective function?
Right.
Right? I think there's layers of that. And like when you go all the way up, you really think about, okay, what's the role of a CEO at a company?
Mm-hmm.
Set the vision, set the strategy, set the goals, kind of steer the ship in the right direction. And then you've got kind of all the layers that support that underneath. And there's strategic
Right.
layers and then there's execution layers. And so, where is AI good at? Like, can it
Right.
run a Fortune 500 company? No.
Right.
Right. And
You
so
know
I
what it
just think
remind?
about,
Yeah.
you know,
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just going to interject
that's
that
okay.
it reminds me of a quote that I actually have to give credit to Srini Koshik from Rackspace. The way that he says it is AI helps machines be better machines and humans be better humans. That really resonates with me, you know? Because I mean,
100%. I think we're going to get back
yeah.
to being more human.
I think so
Honestly.
too. I think so too. I think that's a really interesting way to look at it. How can we leverage, or how will AI help elevate us to a point where, we are focusing on the things that are the most important? Because how much time do we, to your point earlier about searching through SharePoint and things like that, how much time do we spend on these time-consuming tasks that really provide no value, when that stuff could be automated, so that then we can focus on the important stuff, making sure that systems are built to meet the needs of our users, and so forth. Which brings me actually to another concept around innovation. And as we're sort of grappling, I think we as humans have some grappling to do, I think, with how far we want to bring AI, and where do we say, hey, look, AI stops here and humanity starts here. And I wonder if an interesting way to sort of look through that lens is the concept of innovation. And I'm just curious, when you look at this through the very rich lens that you have around AI and the AI ecosystem and so forth, how do and you think about our tech ecosystem, what elements in your mind are crucial for fostering innovation and growth within the enterprise?
Yeah, I actually was just on a panel last week talking about innovation and one of the questions is around defining what that is, right? Because that's also a loaded term quite a bit.
Right.
And I think it's newness, and the way that I positioned it was, you've got your problem space and you've got your solution space, right? Every product manager knows this. Your problem space is, what problems are we tackling? What part of the universe are we going after? And your solution space are the things you're trying to solve those problems. And I think a lot of people focus innovation on the latter, on the solution space. Can we solve this problem this way, this way, that way, right? Let's try all these different things and experiment. And I
Right,
think
right,
that's
right.
great. And I think AI will be great at that. I think actually AI will help with that,
Hmm.
helping with the solution space discovery. But the problem space is actually more interesting to me. And I think if you look at any big innovator, they reframe the problem space and then they go after it.
Hmm.
And I actually think that's much harder to do because it requires really deep thought about what the problem is, how we're thinking about the problem,
Right, right, right.
and you know what what have we deemed the thing to go after, and did we deem that correctly? And I think that's the human part that takes really complex thinking, and it takes a lot of abstract thinking, and that's really hard to nail down.
Hmm.
So I actually think AI can be great at kind of the rapid solution iteration side, but maybe we spend more of our time rethinking the problems.
Right. Well, and to your point, a lot of times, we're trying to solve problems that have real impact to real people. And that requires also empathic thinking, being able to have empathy towards other humans. And I agree with you. Those are the kinds of things that, hopefully over time, artificial intelligence will make us even better at being at demonstrating empathy towards other humans. To your point,
I hope
Srini's
so.
point, yeah.
We could use more empathy.
Yeah, I hear you. So, this technology is advancing so fast, and there's so much to consider with the intersection between the technology and humanity and ethics and the legal ramifications of decisions that we're making, and so forth. How do you, filter through the noise to focus on what matters the most?
I think for me, I tend to focus on things I find interesting. So yeah, the ecosystem is changing pretty rapidly. I also like to
Yeah.
look at things holistically. So
Yeah.
this is a really nerdy analogy, but I'm going to do it anyway. So if you're familiar with gradient descent, right? It's you got a step, initialization point, and imagine you're on a mountain, right? And there's a whole mountain range,
Hmm.
and you're on one mountain, and if your goal is to descend as fast as possible, to get to a minimum, or to ascend as fast as possible to get to the top of the mountain, one, you got to make sure you're on the right mountain, and two, you've got to, look at the next step. So the way the gradient descent works is you measure the slope of the areas around you, and you go to the steepest slope.
Hmm.
And so when I think about trying to think about the noise, right, I want to look at the mountain range, and I want to look at all the things. I want to look at cybersecurity for AI. I want to look at legal for AI, regulations, risk management, the technical landscape, the architecture. I want to look at all of it. Those are the mountain ranges. And then within each of them, I want to find the information that's going to get me the most comprehensive understanding as fast as possible on each of those domains. And constantly looking back, am I missing a domain? Like, am I missing something holistically?
Hmm.
Or how can I find more valuable information on that one thing? And I think when you're looking at any sort of complex technology, that's the hard part. When you're just getting
Right.
started, you don't know what the mountain range looks like. You're just learning this term, or you're learning this thing. And
Right.
I'll say that people who've been in the space for a long time, they have a leg up because they know the mountain range pretty well.
I agree. So, taking that analogy, I would say you and your career, you have traversed many large and gnarly mountains, and I'm just curious, for those that would want to follow in your footsteps, what advice would you give them?
If you want an easy career, this is not it.
I
It's
believe
not
it.
easy.
I believe it.
But if you are perpetually curious and persistent,
Hmm.
which are two of the values of our company, by the way, is persistence
Okay.
and curiosity,
I was going to ask you what the other
then
two
it is
values were, so thank you.
right. Then it is fun. I will say it's a blast. It's so much fun, and I just encourage people, if you want to pursue this path, I think that's
Hmm.
great. But just know that you're going to need a strong support system, good friends, good family, or chosen family, however you do that, a
Yep.
good community, and you need to disassociate yourself and your identity with your career. I would say that's a really important thing. I've seen a lot of founders spiral because
Hmm.
they tie their identity very closely with their career, and it's hard not to, but it can lead to a lot of turmoil. So it's important not to do that. And that's probably more broadly applicable to anybody in their career, right? Not just
Right.
entrepreneurs. Um,
Agreed.
and you know, laugh at things. If I always, it's the common saying, if you don't laugh, you'll cry. So, I often laugh at the
Well said.
absurdity of
Heck yeah.
stuff.
Yeah. I love it. Having a sense of humor is, yeah, incredibly important. Well, I tell you what, Rehgan, this has been an inspiring discussion. Thanks so much for sharing all of your wisdom with us, with the community, and I count myself lucky to count you as a part of my tribe of mentors. So thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you. I'm excited to watch the other episodes. If you haven't subscribed and you're listening to this, you should do that because the series
Heck
is going to
yeah.
be great. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you, Rehgan. Have a great day.
Too.